Let me ask you something. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, completely alert, staring at the ceiling, wondering why your brain decided 2 a.m. was the perfect time to replay that embarrassing thing you said in high school? You probably thought something was wrong with you, that your sleep was broken. But what if I told you that waking up at 2 a.m. isn't broken at all? That for most of human history, it was actually the schedule. Before electricity, before street lamps, before the glowing rectangle in your pockets that you check one last time before closing your eyes, medieval people slept in a way that would absolutely baffle us today. And honestly, modern science is starting to think they might have been onto something. I'm talking about the weird, forgotten, and sometimes disturbing sleep habits of the Middle Ages. The beds full of bugs, the strangers snoring next to you at the inn, the hats. Oh, the hats. And the one sleep practice that was so strange, historians didn't even believe it was real until they found the evidence written right into the literature. If you're new here, I make videos about the history they didn't teach you in school. So hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you don't miss the next one. And tonight, before you get too comfortable in that expensive mattress of yours, let's talk about what it really meant to fall asleep in a world without streetlights, without central heating, and without any guarantee you'd wake up in the morning. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, not because of a nightmare or a barking dog, but simply because your body decided it was time. You're wide awake, the room is dark, the fire has burned down to glowing embers. And instead of reaching for your phone or groaning about having to be up in 4 hours, you do something strange. You get out of bed. You tend the fire. You might even walk next door to check on a neighbor or climb back into bed with your spouse for reasons that have nothing to do with sleep. Then, after an hour or two, you drift back off until sunrise. Sounds bizarre, right? Like something people would only do if their sleep schedule had been completely destroyed by modern life. But here's the thing that will make you rethink everything you know about rest. For most of human history, this was completely normal. In fact, it was the only way people slept. Medieval men and women didn't experience sleep the way we do. They didn't view 8 uninterrupted hours as the gold standard of health. They didn't panic when they woke up at 2 a.m., wondering why their brain was suddenly alert. They expected it. It was called segmented sleep, or sometimes first sleep and second sleep, and it was so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life that everyone from peasants to kings followed the same basic rhythm. The pattern was simple. After sunset, when work was done and the animals were settled, people would crawl onto their straw pallets and drift into what they called first sleep. This wasn't a light nap. It was deep, genuine rest, the kind your body craves after a day of physical labor in the fields or the workshop. Then, sometime around midnight, something remarkable happened. They woke up. Not startled, not anxious, but naturally, as if an internal alarm clock had gently tapped them on the shoulder. Here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, a little unexpected. This waking period, this strange gap in the middle of the night, wasn't seen as a problem to be fixed. It was seen as useful, valuable, even. Medieval people called it the watch, and they filled it with all kinds of activities. Some of them practical, some of them spiritual, and some of them the kind you might not expect to find in a history book. Housewives used the time to tend the fire or check on the children. Farmers might step outside to make sure the livestock was safe, or to gaze at the stars and predict tomorrow's weather. But for many, this was also a time of quiet intimacy. Medieval medical texts and marriage manuals actually recommended this window for physical connection between husbands and wives. The reasoning was surprisingly sensible. After first sleep, the body was rested, but not yet burdened by the thoughts and worries of the coming day. The mind was calm, the house was still, and the darkness provided a kind of privacy that was nearly impossible to find during daylight hours in a world where entire families often shared one room. Historians have found references to this in letters, in poetry, even in church records, where priests gently reminded their flocks that what happened between married couples during the watch was natural and blessed, as long as it stayed within the bounds of the marriage bed. But the watch wasn't only about intimacy. For the deeply religious, those quiet hours were sacred. Monks rose for a prayer service called matins, chanting psalms by candlelight while the rest of the world slept. Pious laypeople might recite prayers or read from devotional texts, using the stillness to contemplate their souls and prepare for the possibility that they might not see the sunrise. Because in the Middle Ages, death was never far from anyone's mind, and waking up in the middle of the night was a reminder that life was fragile, and sleep was, in some ways, a rehearsal for the grave. So how do we know this was real? How do we know medieval people weren't just suffering from chronic insomnia? The evidence is everywhere once you start looking. Court records mention people being awake during the watch and getting into trouble. Literature from the period casually references first sleep and second sleep as if everyone understood exactly what those terms meant. Chaucer wrote about it. Doctors discussed it in medical texts. Even the Catholic Church structured its prayer schedule around it. For centuries, this was simply how humans slept. Then came the Industrial Revolution, with its gas lamps and factory whistles, and the relentless demand for productivity. Night became something to conquer, not something to live within, and segmented sleep, that ancient natural rhythm, was slowly forgotten. Here's the twist that makes all of this feel strangely relevant. Modern sleep science has recently started to suggest that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for the human body than our modern 8-hour block. Researchers have conducted experiments where they removed artificial light and asked participants to sleep naturally. Within weeks, many of them spontaneously reverted to the 2-sleep cycle. They started waking in the middle of the night, feeling alert and calm, before drifting back to sleep. It turns out that medieval people weren't broken sleepers. They were following an ancient pattern that our bodies still remember, even if our modern schedules have forced us to forget. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, don't reach for the sleeping pill. Don't panic. Just lie there for a moment and consider the possibility that you're not broken. You're medieval, and somewhere in the darkness, your ancestors are smiling, because they knew something we've only just begun to rediscover. Now, once they finally drifted back into second sleep, where exactly did they lay their heads? Because the medieval bed was nothing like what you're imagining. And honestly, you might want to wash your sheets after you hear about it. Now that you know medieval people spent their nights in 2 distinct sleeps, with that strange and useful waking period tucked between them, the natural next question is probably something like this. Where did they actually sleep? What did the medieval bed look like? Because if you're picturing something comfortable, something cozy, something that resembles the mattress you're probably lying on or sitting on right now, I need you to adjust your expectations immediately. The medieval bed was not a place of rest and relaxation. It was a survival strategy. It was a negotiation with the cold, with the insects, with the constant threat of waking up poorer than you went to sleep. And in some cases, it was a literal pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of exhaustion and bad luck. Let's start with the average peasant, which means most of the population. If you were a farmer, a laborer, or anyone who didn't own land worth mentioning, your bed was probably a pallet. Now, pallet sounds almost charming, like something you'd buy at a rustic furniture store for way too much money. In reality, a pallet was a sack stuffed with straw. That's it. Straw. The same stuff that went on the floor of the barn. You might have a rough linen sack to hold it together if you were lucky. If you weren't, the straw just went directly on the dirt floor, and you slept on top of it like an animal making a nest. And here's the thing about straw. It's cheap, it's plentiful, it's decent insulation if you pile it thick enough. But it's also crunchy. It shifts under you while you sleep. It pokes through whatever fabric is containing it. And it is absolutely irresistible to anything with legs. We're talking fleas, lice, spiders, and the occasional mouse who decided your bedding was a fantastic place to raise a family. You didn't so much lie down on a medieval peasant bed as you settled onto a whole ecosystem. Now, if you had a bit more money, or maybe just a relative who was handy with wood, you might elevate that straw onto a wooden frame. This was a genuine upgrade, not because it changed the sleeping experience dramatically, but because it slightly reduced the odds of something crawling into your ear while you dreamed. Slightly. The frame also kept you just a little further from the drafts that swept across the floor, because medieval houses weren't exactly sealed against the elements. Windows were often just holes in the wall covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. Doors didn't fit tightly. The wind came in whenever it felt like it. So raising the bed even a few inches off the ground meant the difference between merely cold and actually frozen. But here's where things take a turn that might make you grateful for your own bedroom. Sheets were a luxury. Most people didn't own them. You slept in the clothes you wore all day, partly for warmth, and partly because pajamas as a concept hadn't really been invented yet, and you almost never slept alone. Whole families piled onto the same straw, parents, children, maybe a grandparent, arranged like logs in a fireplace for maximum heat retention. If you got too warm, you could always roll away from your cousin's elbow. If you got too cold, you pressed closer and hoped no one had fleas that night. Privacy was not a concept anyone worried about. Modesty was handled by the simple fact that everyone was too exhausted and too cold to care. For nobles, of course, the story was different. If you were rich enough, you slept on feathers. Real feathers, piled high inside a thick fabric casing, supported by rope or wooden slats. These beds were so valuable that they were passed down in wills. You didn't just inherit land or gold. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed, and you were grateful for it. Some noble beds were massive, wide enough for 4 or 5 people, with heavy curtains that could be drawn shut to trap heat and block drafts. Those curtains also provided something peasants rarely had, a small measure of privacy. Behind the drapes, with the candles snuffed and the servants dismissed, noble couples could escape, if only briefly, from the constant surveillance of castle life. Still, even the richest bed in the Middle Ages came with problems. Feathers attracted their own pests. Mattresses grew musty and foul over time, and no amount of wealth could completely banish the cold that seeped through stone walls or the damp that crept up from the floor. A noble bed was better than a peasant pallet, but it wasn't what you'd call comfortable by modern standards. It was just less awful. And here's the part that really sticks with you once you know it. People rarely changed their bedding. Washing was difficult, time-consuming, and required resources most people didn't have. So that straw pallet you slept on tonight? It was the same straw you slept on last month and last year, and it showed, it smelled, it shifted, it crawled. But you didn't complain, because complaining implied there was an alternative. There wasn't. You slept where you could, how you could, and you thanked God every morning that you'd woken up at all. Because in the Middle Ages, the bed wasn't just where you rested, it was where you might die, and everyone knew it. So what did people wear into these strange, communal, infested beds? Did they strip down? Did they have special sleeping clothes? The answer might surprise you, and it involves hats. Specifically, the kind of hats that would make you look twice if you saw someone wearing one today. But in the Middle Ages, these ridiculous-looking accessories were the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Now that you've seen the medieval bed for what it really was, a straw-filled ecosystem crawling with life and shared with strangers, you're probably wondering what people actually wore when they crawled into that mess. Did they strip down to nothing? Did they have special sleeping clothes? The answer reveals something surprising about medieval priorities, and it involves one of the most misunderstood accessories in all of history: the nightcap. When you hear the words nightcap today, your brain probably goes to something cozy. A warm drink before bed, maybe with a little whiskey, enjoyed by the fire while you wind down from the day. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, physical, often ridiculous-looking hat that served a purpose so crucial that people wore them even when they shared a bed with complete strangers, even when they looked absolutely absurd, even when the hat itself became a kind of social signal that everyone instantly understood. Let's start with the obvious question. Why a hat? Why would anyone choose to sleep in headwear that looks like something a wizard might wear to a chimney sweep convention? The answer is cold. Pure, simple, life-threatening cold. Medieval buildings were not built for insulation. Stone walls conducted cold like they were designed for it. Windows were covered with thin animal horn or oiled parchment that did almost nothing to stop the wind. Roofs leaked. Floors were often just packed earth that stayed damp year-round. And here's the thing about human bodies that medieval people understood very well. You lose heat fastest through your head. So if you could only afford to keep one part of yourself warm while you slept, that was the part to prioritize. A wool or linen cap, pulled down over the ears and forehead, could mean the difference between waking up and not waking up on a freezing winter night. But the nightcap wasn't just about survival. It was also about hygiene. And this is where things get a little uncomfortable. Remember that straw pallet we talked about? Remember the fleas, the lice, the general ecosystem of tiny creatures making themselves at home in your bedding? A nightcap provided a small barrier between your hair and whatever was crawling through the straw. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was. But it helped. And in a world where washing your hair meant a major production involving cold water, scarce soap, and absolutely no guarantee of actually getting clean, anything that reduced the number of creatures taking up residence in your scalp was worth wearing, even if it made you look like you'd escaped from a fairy tale. For men, the nightcap was straightforward. A simple linen or wool hat, often with a long point at the end that could be tucked in or left dangling, depending on personal preference. Some were plain, some were embroidered. A few, belonging to wealthier men, might even have decorative elements that showed off the family's status, because nothing says we've made it quite like going to bed with a tiny family crest on your head. For women, the situation was more complicated. Many women wore some form of head covering at all times, not just while sleeping. Married women in particular were expected to keep their hair covered in public as a sign of modesty and virtue. So the nightcap for women often blended seamlessly with the headwear they wore during the day, a coif or a wrap that served double duty. It kept them warm, it kept them modest, and it kept the lice at bay all at once. But here's where the nightcap takes a turn into something unexpectedly social. In medieval towns and cities, the nightcap became a symbol. If you answered your door wearing one, it was a polite way of saying, "I'm not dressed for company, and I'm not interested in conversation." It was the medieval equivalent of a "do not disturb" sign. Merchants and tradesmen understood this immediately. If they knocked on a door and saw the homeowner in a nightcap, they knew to come back later. It was a signal, a piece of visual language that everyone spoke without ever saying a word. And of course, the nightcap was rarely worn alone. It was usually paired with a nightshirt, a long loose tunic that covered the body from neck to ankles. These weren't sexy. They weren't designed to impress anyone. They were practical, shapeless, and often made from rough fabric that itched against the skin. But they served their purpose. They added another layer of warmth. They provided a small barrier between your body and the straw. And if you were sharing a bed with strangers at an inn, which we'll get to soon, they preserved at least the appearance of modesty in a situation where true privacy was completely impossible. So the next time you pull on a pair of soft pajamas and climb into your temperature-controlled bedroom, spare a thought for the medieval sleeper. They wore hats to bed, not because they were fashionable, not because they were eccentric, but because the alternative was waking up with frostbitten ears or something worse crawling through their hair. And they did it without complaint, because in the Middle Ages, comfort wasn't something you expected. It was something you dreamed about, usually while wearing a wool hat that made you look like an extra from a fantasy movie. But the nightcap was just the beginning. The real challenge came when you tried to sleep somewhere other than your own home. When you traveled, when you sought shelter at an inn, when you had no choice but to trust complete strangers with your safety, your belongings, and your sleep. And that, as you're about to discover, was a whole different kind of nightmare. Have you ever stayed in a hostel? One of those budget places where you pay next to nothing for a bed and quickly discover why it costs next to nothing? The room has 4 beds, maybe 6. The person in the bunk across from you snores like a dying engine. Someone else keeps rustling a plastic bag at 3 a.m. And the bathroom situation is something you actively try not to think about. Now take that experience, remove the door, remove the lock, remove any expectation of privacy whatsoever, and add the very real possibility that the stranger breathing 3 feet away might steal everything you own while you sleep. Congratulations. You've just imagined what it was like to stay at a medieval inn. Let's say you're a merchant traveling between towns, or a pilgrim making your way to a distant shrine, or just someone whose donkey gave up halfway to nowhere. Night is falling. The road is dark. Wolves exist. You need shelter. So you find an inn, assuming there is one, which wasn't always guaranteed in medieval Europe. You walk inside, you pay your coins, and you ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room. It's not even a bed. What you get is a spot in a bed that already contains other people. Complete strangers, possibly strangers who haven't bathed since last spring. And you're expected to climb in next to them, fall asleep, and trust that you'll wake up with your purse still attached to your belt. This wasn't considered strange. It wasn't considered a violation of personal space, because personal space as a concept barely existed. Inns operated on a simple principle: maximum bodies, minimum space. If a bed could hold 3 people, they put 3 people in it. If it could hold 4, they squeezed in 4. Sometimes the beds were in a shared hall, rows of them lined up like a medieval field hospital. Sometimes they were in a single room, with everyone piled together regardless of gender, age or profession. A few inns made half-hearted attempts at separation, men on one side, women on the other. But those were suggestions more than rules. And when the inn was full and travelers were still arriving, the floor worked just fine. You paid for a spot on the rushes, the layer of reeds and herbs scattered over the dirt, and you hoped whoever slept next to you wasn't carrying anything contagious. Now let's talk about the bed itself, assuming you were lucky enough to get one. It was probably straw, just like at home, but straw that had been slept on by dozens of travelers before you. Straw that might still be warm from the last occupant. Straw that definitely contained fleas, because fleas don't check out when the guest does. The sheets, if there were sheets, were changed maybe once a month, maybe less. The pillow was whatever you brought or whatever you could roll up from your cloak. And the blanket was shared. Always shared. You and the stranger on your left and the stranger on your right all pulled on the same worn wool cover and hoped nobody had night sweats. Privacy was not an option. If you needed to use the chamber pot, you did it while everyone pretended not to notice. If you wanted to pray or read or simply be alone for a few minutes, you were out of luck. The medieval inn was a communal experience in the most literal sense possible. You ate together, you drank together, and you slept together, piled into the same space like livestock in a storm. And here's where things get genuinely tense. You couldn't trust anyone. Travelers carried their wealth on their bodies, coins sewn into clothing, purses tied to belts, sometimes hidden in boots or under hats. Thieves knew this. Some people traveled specifically to pose as honest merchants while they waited for fellow guests to fall asleep. So you learned to sleep light. You learned to position yourself with your back to the wall and your hand on your belongings. You learned to wake at the slightest movement and to size up your bedmates before you ever closed your eyes. If someone looked shady, you requested a different spot, or you simply stayed awake until they left. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Despite all of this, despite the fleas and the thieves and the strangers snoring in your ear, the inn was still better than the alternative. The alternative was the road at night, alone, in the dark, with wolves and outlaws and things that went bump in ways you didn't want to investigate. So you paid your coins, you climbed into the straw, and you hoped. You hoped the stranger next to you was just a tired traveler and not a thief. You hoped the scratching sounds were rats and not something worse. You hoped you'd wake up in the morning with your belongings and your life still intact. And if you were very lucky, you did. But the inn wasn't the only place where medieval people shared sleep with strangers. Sometimes the strangers were in your own home. Sometimes they were there by choice, and sometimes they were there because the alternative was worse. And the rules about who could share your bed and under what circumstances were far more complicated than you might imagine. Now, after everything you've heard about sharing beds with strangers at drafty inns, you might be tempted to think that medieval people only slept in groups when they were traveling or desperate. That at home, in their own beds, they finally enjoyed the luxury of solitude. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the Middle Ages, sleeping alone was the exception, not the rule. And if you did sleep alone, people noticed. They talked. They wondered what was wrong with you. Because in a world where warmth was scarce and danger lurked in every shadow, solitude wasn't privacy. It was suspicion. Let's start with the simplest reason for communal sleeping. Survival. Medieval houses were cold. Not chilly, not drafty, but genuinely cold in a way that modern central heating has erased from our collective memory. The fireplace, if there was one, was usually in the main living area. Bedrooms, if they existed at all, weren't heated. So when night fell and the fire burned down to embers, the temperature dropped fast and dropped, and kept dropping until everything in the house was the same temperature as the air outside, which in winter meant well below freezing. Bodies generate heat. Lots of bodies generate lots of heat. So families piled together, parents and children, and sometimes grandparents, all in the same bed or the same pile of straw, sharing warmth the way penguins huddle in a blizzard. It wasn't cozy. It was necessary. You didn't ask if you wanted to sleep next to your brother. You asked which side of him was warmer. But warmth wasn't the only reason. Space was also a factor. Most peasant homes consisted of one room, just one. You cooked there, you ate there, you worked there, and you slept there. There was nowhere else to go. Beds took up space, and space was limited. So if you had a bed large enough for 4 people, you put 4 people in it. If you had a bed large enough for 6, you found 6. The idea of a bed reserved for just 2 people, a married couple alone together, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Even then, servants often slept in the same room, sometimes on pallets at the foot of the bed, sometimes sharing the bed itself if space was tight. Privacy wasn't something you expected. It wasn't something you even thought to want. You slept where you could, with whoever was there, and you considered yourself lucky to be indoors. Now let's talk about the implications of all this closeness, because they're not what you might expect. When families shared beds, when servants slept beside masters, when travelers piled together at inns, lines blurred, boundaries shifted. Things happened that people didn't always talk about. Medieval court records are full of cases involving exactly what you're imagining. Accusations, scandals, pregnancies that couldn't be explained by the usual stories. The church, ever watchful, tried to regulate it all. Priests warned against the dangers of shared beds, the temptations that arose when bodies pressed together in the dark. They told married couples to sleep separately during holy seasons. They told pilgrims to keep their hands where God could see them. But the rules only went so far. Reality was messier. In a world where everyone slept together, things happened. Not always bad things, not always scandalous things, but things that remind us that medieval people were human, with all the complications that come with it. And yet, despite the risks, despite the occasional scandal, communal sleeping continued, because the alternative was worse. Sleeping alone meant being vulnerable. It meant facing the night without witnesses. And in the Middle Ages, the night was when the devil worked. Demons prowled, spirits wandered. Evil lurked in corners that firelight couldn't reach. Having others nearby wasn't just about warmth or space. It was about protection. If something came for you in the dark, at least someone would hear you scream. At least someone would see what took you. At least you wouldn't face whatever lurked in the shadows alone. So families slept together. Communities slept together. Strangers slept together. And in that closeness, in that constant press of bodies, medieval people found something we've largely lost. Not privacy, obviously, but connection. A kind of intimacy that didn't require words. The warmth of another person on a freezing night. The sound of breathing that meant you weren't alone. The knowledge that whatever came in the darkness, you'd face it together. But what about those who chose solitude? What about the monks and nuns who slept alone in cold cells, or the hermits who sought isolation in the wilderness? Their stories reveal another side of medieval sleep entirely. One where solitude wasn't comfort, but discipline. Where sleep itself became a spiritual battlefield. And that's where we're headed next.